David Page, welcome to Acquiring Minds.
Hello, good to see you.
I've been working on you for a year, David. So this is a minor victory to have you here sitting in front of me. Thank you for coming on.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here.
We met at the ETA meetup in San Francisco last, November, December. You are Bay Area based, as I was up until just a few months ago. And you acquired and own a business called Post and Trellis. It's a wines and vines business, as you called it. You bought it in 2011, and it's now a much larger operation than it was back then. So I'm eager to share this really interesting business story with the audience. Please start us off, David, with a little personal history. How did you originally come to the U.S.?
Sure. Well, it is an interesting story because I guess I started out in England and I managed to get myself to a good university where I had a lot of choice what I could do. At that point when you're leaving university, there's lots of branches right out in front of you and you're trying to figure out which one to crawl along. And there was several on that kind of tree of options that just did not appeal. Most of them were around kind of finance or what's called the City of London. I just didn't dig the whole kind of pinstripe formality. It seemed like a very, very staid version of a very, very private school and a snobby place. It just didn't gel with me at all. So I had grown up with my father running a small business at home. And so lunchtimes when I was around were kind of discussing little facets of his business and the world. So yeah, I felt more affinity for commerce, more affinity for business, and decided to kind of ignore the professions as they were called after university and head leftwards. And that made for a really, really fascinating kind of first 10 years of a career. I started off working within the software industry and specifically sales. The reason being that I wanted to earn as much money as possible, and it was a very well paid kind of junior position. But also because I wanted to learn more and more about other businesses. I was aware that I had seen the world kind of through the very narrow lens of my father's operation. And by being a software sales guy, I basically got to go in to hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of companies and say, okay, how do you do business? How do you acquire customers? What do you do with the customers? How do you service the customers? How do you operate? How do you distribute? Whatever the model was in all different sectors, and just talk to them about their business and see how I could help. We had just a little software utility solution that could help various businesses in various ways, and so it was a really good exploration in business. It also became a fantastic passport because it offered me the opportunity to get on a plane to San Francisco. They wanted someone to set up their American operation, and age 27, 28, I managed to convince them that was me. Probably through the paucity of other good options, but it got me on a plane. They in fact wanted to set up in LA, and I knew from talking about I just didn't want to live in LA, but San Francisco sounded cool. And so, I managed to twist their arms and tell them
I know that decision.
Yeah, exactly. All serious technology companies have a base in Silicon Valley, and surely that's where we should be. And so they bought that, they bought me, and they sent us off. And there was a few of us who came over to set up kind of bold Brits who had a really fun adventure. But after a few more years of that, I suddenly looked around and was having great fun. Had 5 different jobs in 2 different countries, but suddenly I've been at this one company for 10 years and it's time to do something else. So I went off and actually went traveling around the world for a year. It's something that English people do a fair bit. They take a little sabbatical, pack a backpack.
They do it before or right after university though, don't they? Yeah,
so there's a gap year, which I did too, but those folks that have done a gap year tend to kind of try and repeat at some point in their lives because it's such fun and it's such a great thing to do. I got on the road again, came back, and at that point I'd basically packed everything I owned up into the trunk of an old car in a goat barn south of San Jose, so that it wouldn't disappear. But the idea was I can come back from my year off and live anywhere I want in the world, do whatever I want. I was 30 something ish, but unmarried, no kids. So yeah, I had that wonderful dose of freedom, but decided on completion of that trip that I actually wanted to come back to the Bay Area. That was my kind of heart and home by now. And that it was a great place to kind of pursue a profession. I think there's a lot of, I loved England. It's a great place. I love going back, but I don't want to live there again. And I adore America. I think there's some serious iniquities and kind of issues with American society, but overall, it's a great place to kind of make a career and make a life and provide for a family. So yeah, I decided to come back and did one more startup for a year or two until we pivoted to agriculture, and then suddenly I realized I had absolutely nothing in common with a corn farmer in Iowa. So exited stage left from the startup, and by that time I still had some savings. I've always been a saver, not a spender. When I was working within kind of the software world, I guess I had like 50, 60 guys working for me who all outspent me. They were all kind of driving fancy cars and kind of living the good life, and I was living a good life too, but I just wasn't a spender. So I'd steadily been saving away, knowing, I guess, that not only did I want to pay for future trips, but also perhaps pay for a future business venture. So at that point, I started looking for businesses to buy. That would have been about 2010.
And let me jump in with a couple of questions here, David. So first of all, quick aside on the Bay Area. Having lived there myself and been drawn there myself, it is a special place despite the well-publicized problems. And it does have a certain magnetic pull. I love that you took a gap year and saw many places around the world and still felt like it deserved your residence. I think that's quite a statement. This startup that you came back and did, were you one of the co-founders, or were you in sales operation at that job?
No, it was one of the senior management team. There was only, 30 or 40 of us by the time I left. It subsequently got bought by Monsanto, of all people. But at the time there wasn't that many of us, and I was the VP of sales and running a small team as we were trying to figure out which market to operate in, and which markets we could kind of make headway, and we just didn't really know which areas to direct ourselves at. So anyway, yeah, it was a good choice and a kind of a good business, but it didn't work out personally.
Okay, as you know, you're kind of edging toward your entrepreneurial journey. You are somebody who's attracted to business. I mean, you made that very clear. Your father ran a business, and you're in San Francisco, and you're working in tech. So did you ever entertain any ideas, start from scratch ideas, tech-related ideas?
Oh, really? I think by then I'd scratched that itch and had enough. I think software for me was a way to learn about the world rather than a kind of an end in itself. I think another software company, I did interview at a few, but none of them pulled at me at all. And then, when I started looking at companies for sale, and I knew that companies kind of were bought and sold. Remember that, the ETA world was much, much kind of thinner and less kind of professional and much less well-resourced than it is now. There was no search funder network. There was no Acquiring Minds podcast. So I was stabbing in the dark a little bit. But I did know one little jewel, and that was that companies sold. Not just because I'd seen a couple of bigger companies that I'd worked for sold, but also I'd seen my father have a go at buying a very, very small company. And that kind of triggered just a memory in me, or a future memory in me, that this was something that was possible to do. So yeah, I literally got on the internet and found BizBuySell, or whatever they were called in those days, BizGenBuy.gov, something, I don't know. There were some really weird sites, but they were they were out there selling businesses, and started looking at what was interesting. And because I had a relatively good breadth of commercial experience and a decent amount of kind of actual management and personal sales experience, I kind of backed myself to be able to pull it off, and to be able to step into a world where because I knew it wasn't going to be, as we said, software. So whichever company I bought, I was not going to be the expert on day one. I was going to need to listen hard and work harder. And so, yeah, I found myself looking at all sorts of weird, wonderful companies. I think one that came up when we met was the Circus.
Well, David, let's put a pin in that because I want to hear. There was a number of weird and wonderful companies, and I want to spend a minute on them. Yeah. But tell us, what was the business that your dad had?
So he basically was effectively a kind of a what you would call now a kind of a 1099 employee. So he was an international operator for French wine companies. So he became their UK Limited or UK LLC, and kind of ran their international operations for a bunch of small to medium-sized wineries to enable them to approach kind of export markets, essentially.
And did you see him as then self-employed? I mean, my impression was that he had his own business.
Yeah, I mean, it was essentially his own marketing business, but he was also essentially kind of like an employee, but he wasn't running the wineries. He wasn't actually running the core businesses that he was representing. He was running their representation in other markets. So, but it still meant that, he had to file accounts. He had to figure out which clients he wanted to get after. He had to, get out and make his way in the world. So he had to be proactive, and that was at least informative.
Yeah, sure. Well, it reminds me of how you felt like just getting out into the world was a little bit more what drew you versus going to, what did you say, the City of London? Is that
exactly.
the title for the high finance world in London? Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, it's the same. It's what we call Wall Street, essentially.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it definitely resonated more.
And David, your decision now to buy a business, and you're in your mid-30s, as you pointed out in 2010, 2011, search, capital S search is, I don't know if that term was even around then. It was certainly a very immature space. Of course, as we all know, people have been buying and selling businesses for a long time. You had that inkling, which is what turned you onto it. But there wasn't this well-trodden path. Still not very well-trodden, but certainly more than it was 10 years ago, 12 years ago. When you told other people in your world that you were going to do this, how did they react? And just personally and emotionally, was this like a big decision? You're making it seem rather graceful and frictionless, but just it's a giant decision, and as we'll find out, it was a huge pivot in your life.
Yeah, so I'm sure it was stressful. I definitely got some interesting feedback from folks. I have a very good friend here who works as a senior manager within Facebook, or now Meta, and he just couldn't believe it. He was like, "Well, but why would you do that? You could earn X 100,000, doing what you've done before. What's the advantage?" So it's interesting talking to him now 10 years later. But I was also being kind of besieged to kind of go to the East Coast, and that was really the thing that I didn't want to do before I went traveling. Was come and kind of run the company out of Boston. Like, no thanks. I moved out of a cold country. I now love living in a warm state, and I don't want to be somewhere where it can snow in April or May. All love and affection for Boston aside, it's just not somewhere I want to live personally. So there was definitely people cautioning me against it, and there was definitely can I pull this off kind of question mark in my head. But at the same time, I had just kind of almost made the decision inevitable by ripping up a career and going traveling for a year, and then kind of, even though I'd come back and then work for another startup, I hadn't kind of lined up the next job and marched into it. And in fact, I had to pop back to the UK for 4 or 5 months to nurse my dad. So there was some natural breaks there that kind of were pushing me as well. And also was encouraged by what I saw. There were definitely some sensible businesses out there, and in the days of kind of 2 and 3 multiples for kind of really pretty decent sized, certainly a decent sized business to a solo operator, it seemed I could make more money and have more fun. And I was really looking for income, interest, and independence. Those are my kind of 3 watchwords. And yeah, it was a bit kind of over quaint the way that they were all started at I, but it really kind of boiled down to like, okay, I need to provide for myself, but I also want to have some interest. I want to do something interesting. I don't want to just kind of keep farming money in and not really enjoying myself. And then the independence part of it was I didn't really feel much independence whenever I was working for another company. Even what's that saying in the Star Wars movie? There's always a bigger fish. And there is, that you're always working for. There's another boss, and then another boss, and then there's the owner, and so on and so forth. And even though I was getting to reasonably senior levels of small companies, I just never felt like I was kind of really running my own show. It was great to work as a team, but I've really enjoyed doing my own thing. So I could feel that and see it.
Yeah. Well, those 3 interest.
Income and independence.
Interest, income, and independence. Income is the one I was missing. Yeah, well, interestingly, I think those are the 3 characteristics that are probably common to most entrepreneurial ventures. Those are big. So, and I would concur with those. I love how neat and quaint that is. The 3 I's. You may have just trademarked something that I'm going to use and reuse. Okay, so you turn online, you see you're making us all envy with these multiples that you're talking about back in 2010, and you see some, as you said, respectable businesses or some respectably sized businesses. Now, tell us about some of these businesses you didn't buy. A circus?
Yeah. So first off, there was this kind of sea of companies kind of coming my way, and I had to narrow my search and I had to kind of stop and really sit down and think, okay, what was it that I was looking for? And so I started to try and narrow down as much as possible without narrowing down the sector, which is how most of the searches were kind of defined, by narrowing down for size and for operations and ownership and so on and so forth. And yeah, I think I did 3 or 4 LOIs, one bass guitar kind of accessories company, one window screens, kind of online custom-sized window screens, replacement window screens company, one tutoring company, one medical staffing company. And each time I pulled back for a subsequently kind of good reason, but I learned an awful lot in doing that. I learned what was safe and what was not, and where the gotchas were, and where the skeletons might be, and how to analyze SDE properly. Actually, one of the key lessons came, which worked out really well for the Wines and Vines company. I remember speaking to my software company CEO the time that he was kind of in acquisition talks. And he said, it's amazing, this big company comes in and they don't want to see the P&Ls and the balance sheets and all the stuff we create. They just want to see the bank statements. And I was like, kind of, again, logged a memory in me. And so I would do the same thing as I get into this diligence process, and as quickly as possible, I say, I just need to see the bank statements. And
I haven't heard that yet.
Yeah, it just cuts through the crack, basically. You're just seeing kind of whether these cash flows are real or not. And are there positive cash flows? And so, I walked away from a couple of companies where there was just, it looked really good on a P&L, but didn't look so good from another lens. So anyways, I started to kind of teach myself as to, what might be good and what might not be, whilst also kind of still having a bit of a wild hair up my arse to do something kind of fun and wacky. So, customized window screens may not sound that wacky, but it did involve getting on the plane to see a company in Texas that kind of were doing just that. And I'd never even been to Dallas, and all of those people that in that company just looked at me like I was a complete alien. But I'm used to looking like the alien in America, and particularly in certain parts of America, I'm kind of typically greeted like that, as we mentioned with the corn farmers in Iowa. So yeah, the adventures were varied, but I was quite happy to kind of look at some crazy stuff. The circus one popped up because one I just saw it. I thought, well, that's perhaps not such a bad business, but let's see. What's the harm in kind of faxing an NDA? Because this, again, old school stuff, like every NDA had to be
Faxing an
faxed.
NDA.
Oh my god, yeah, it was one of the biggest bits of friction to the whole process. So we faxed the NDA over. Back comes this business, and actually the circus was kind of sensible. It was basically a rip-off or kind of second city Cirque du Soleil. Mm-hmm. So if Cirque du Soleil were showing up in San Francisco, they were in Sacramento. Mm-hmm. Or if Cirque du Soleil were in Sacramento, they were in Reading up the road. They were basically kind of doing the cities that Cirque du Soleil didn't get to, and they were using a lot of the same staff. The same talent, basically, and the same even kind of choreographies, and they had an awful name, but it seemed to me with a bit of branding, a bit of better marketing, kind of a decently paid choreographer and designer, and maybe I could kind of turn this into something that I'd actually want to go see, and it also scratched that traveling itch, right?
Yeah.
This was a horrendously organized company. I mean, they had run the whole company on credit cards, so asking for bank statements was kind of it was fraud. But they did have a tour booked to Brazil and to Argentina and Australia. I was like, okay, this sounds like fun.
All the ports of call that you had been at in your gap year, you were going to get to return
totally.
to.
And again, at that stage, I was not married, didn't have a kid, and this just sounded like a shitload of fun. So I was all about it for a while. Well,
I'm sure there are a lot of people who maybe not very seriously, but have had sort of the fantasy of running away with the circus.
Right.
Anybody who hasn't had that fantasy probably thinks that sounds so strange. But I totally understand, the romance of something like that. So what's better than running away with the circus than just buying the thing and being the guy who owns it?
Right. I guess I was a late bloomer. Most kids kind of dream of running away the circus age 7. I was just doing it age 35.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I decided to give that one a miss, but carried on looking, and there was plenty of other interesting companies that didn't get to LOI stage. Chocolate companies.
Tell us about the dating businesses, early online dating days.
That was another form, a lesbian dating company, and to me that looked like a great business. Right? They built a machine which attracts members. They've now got not only the machine that operates the site, but effectively the kind of the membership and the kind of the marketing operations set up, and they get revenues every single month, like clockwork. On the first day of the month, bang, hits the bank account. And having worked for a software company, I was pretty aware of that advantage, right? Software companies have very, very strong finances. There's a reason that the multiples have gone bananas in the last few years. It's just that their finances are great. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this lesbian dating site, I was like, okay, well, it's like a software company. There's the recurring revenues. Trouble was, it was a lesbian dating site, and I couldn't exactly be the kind of the front of house,
the face.
Yeah, exactly. I have someone somewhere in the world to apologize for, though, because when I was trying to test the site out, I uploaded a dear friend of mine, this lady who lives in Spain. I uploaded her photo to the site and just kind of tested out. What's it like? And we got a date, which we had to decline. So yeah.
Did you decline or ghost? Early ghosting, early lesbian ghosting.
Pretty sure I declined and ran screaming, and at that point realized what the hell am I doing? So yeah, there was that, and then there was also the farmer dating site, which subsequently turned into a pretty decent business. You
said that it showed back up in, what was it, in the Super Bowl? It was kind of like what appeared to be a rinky-dink, very niche dating site, and then.
That's right. Yeah. So I looked it up, and I said, okay, imagine I'm a farmer in Iowa and I want a date. Where's my nearest date? And it said 150 miles away. I know those guys are prepared to kind of travel some distances, but that seemed just non-functional and kind of really just not a good plan. So I dismissed it and walked away. But I did enjoy learning a little bit about the business. They had a great line, which was, because city folk just don't get it. And that was literally the strapline within advertising, because if you're a farmer and you're trying to date someone in the city, they say, oh, let's go for coffee at 9 o'clock at night. Like the farmer says, I'm in bed by then because I'm up at 4 on the combine harvester or whatever. So yeah, there's this kind of farmers dating farmers, which makes great sense.
Yeah.
And then, something like 5, 7, I don't know how many years later, I'm watching San Francisco 49ers in a bar on some playoff game, and up pops this advert because city folk just don't get it. I'm like, okay, great. Someone marched in where I feared to tread, and they made a success of it. So congratulations.
I guess the
to
150-mile dating distances wasn't a problem after all.
Right, yeah. Or maybe they're down to 15 now, but it was fun to see. But yeah, so I moved on from dating businesses, but I was just looking everywhere for God, I don't even remember how long it was, but it was maybe a year of searching. Mm-hmm. It was fascinating and fun, but it was starting to get a bit frustrating towards the end of it. And maybe that's the first time that I actually really felt kind of some doubt. It's like, am I going to be able to kind of find something that kind of fits my search, or am I just wasting a year of my life? Mm-hmm. Again, I had saved the money, so I wasn't spending it quickly, so it wasn't kind of dwindling fast. But I definitely remember thinking that that was the kind of the tough end of the search.
David, can I ask you what your financial picture looked like and tie that into the fact that you were not intending to do an SBA loan?
Yeah, I mean, without getting into the specifics, I'd saved a good wedge from being in a reasonably highly paid software salesperson, then exec for a while. So yeah, I'd spent some traveling. Made some more coming back. But I had hundreds of thousands of dollars to my name, kind of. Mm-hmm. I think close to 7 figures, and or around that mark, and therefore, I was looking at businesses that involved loans and also businesses that could be bought just beneath that.
So you were entertaining an SBA, like you would have done the SBA loan. Okay, yeah. I jumped ahead. I know you ultimately didn't, so I assumed that you never were intending it, but you were open to it. And also just to again kind of like explore a little bit where your head is at. So the model of finance it, buying something for 10 or 20% down, financing the rest and paying for it out of the profits of the business. This kind of LBO model was something that you understood at the outset, or you learned and were pleasantly surprised by, or like what was your sophistication about what the structure of your deal might look like?
Well, I had a widely kind of set search, both for kind of companies around kind of the basically $500,000 and up, I think was around where it was at. Mm-hmm. In terms of purchase price. But yeah, the structure was, rather the sophistication you ask about was kind of rising, but not there initially. I was kind of backing my gut rather than going in there with a kind of a preset criteria.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But at some point you do learn about the SBA loan or seller financing, so you know that financing may well be part of what you.
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
I mean, I knew about getting bank loans. I knew about getting equity investors. I didn't know that much about the SBA to start with, but you speak to one broker, you learn that quite quickly.
Yeah, sure. Great. Okay. Carry on. So we're at the tail end of a year. You're starting to get a little bit concerned, a little bit frustrated.
Yeah,
antsy.
And then at this time, I had an LOI. I think it had just been accepted for a medical staffing company, and the three months previously, I had been to see a wines and vines company, and kind of found a hole in the numbers, where the bank statements just didn't tally with kind of the P&L numbers, and so I said to the owner of that company, I like your business, but it's massively overpriced, and just for your interest, this is what I think it's worth. And thank you very much for spending some time with me. But I'm going to, pursue my search elsewhere. And so fast forward 3 months, the broker came back to me and said, look, I don't know what you're doing, but the owner wants to talk to you again and talk to you about your kind of revised level of kind of valuation. And so at that point we reactivated conversations and going back to the point about interest, being part of the search, running a wines and vines company sounded a bit more fun than the medical staffing. So I just asked those guys to bear with me. And whilst I kind of went into deep due diligence on the wines and vines company. And I've been interested in it at first, partly because, as I mentioned, Dad had been in the wine business. But I think it was more just kind of academic interest than actual interest at first. It's like, what's a guy like me going to be doing with a winery? There's an old saying in the wine business that if you want to make a small fortune, you start with the large one. Mm-hmm. And that I gather it's studied in some business schools as the worst business model ever invented.
Sure.
So.
With that, just behind restaurants, and the classic vanity business, right?
Yeah,
rich guy or gal buys a restaurant or a winery, and then starts with a large fortune and ends with a small one.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it might be even worse than restaurants because it's so capital, time, and labor intensive, and particularly within capital, not just because of kind of land and equipment, but also because it takes several years to either grow vines or take the vines and the fruit that you've grown, and then release it onto a market, and then it's also an ultra competitive, basically low margin market. So heap of money up front, very little money out the back, perfect recipe for disaster. But it's it also had my interest. And so, when I first looked at it, it was surprisingly good business. It was a winery with a vineyard management business attached to it. So they had a small kind of sideline where they weren't buying fruit and they weren't growing their own fruit. They were basically farming small estates in the hills above Silicon Valley and letting those people become kind of wine growers and make wine for them, but also take the surplus wine they didn't need and pushing it out through their own winery. So anyway, it was marketed as a winery, but I really saw a vineyard management company. And essentially as a software company. Here's a company with very heavily recurring revenues, where I can predict this amount of revenue, I can predict this amount of business, and also I think this is a growing market, right? There's not, at the time there was only 20 vineyards under management, 25 maybe, and I could see, that up in the hills above Silicon Valley, there's a lot of very, very fancy estates, a lot of beautiful, beautiful properties where 2 swimming pools and a guest house later. What else are you going to do with that kind of spare acre in the corner? How are you going to keep investing in your home and property? So it seemed to be a good business, the vineyard management side of it, residential vineyard management. It sounds a little weird. It sounds a little idiosyncratic, right? Residential vineyards, but within this kind of weird world that I live in Silicon Valley, it kind of makes sense because there's a lot of money here. There's a lot of depth and breadth of wealth. So I think it's an unusual business, very unusual location. I'm not sure it would work in any other city in America. Maybe someone will prove me wrong, but yes, so I saw this vineyard management business and thought...
David, can I pause you there for a sec? So just to be completely explicit with the audience, this is essentially wealthy people who want, for kind of whatever hobby or interest or investing in their property or vanity, have set up vines on their own property to be able to be producing grapes for wine, and so you're managing those. So these are private little, these estates, private residences. These are not commercial wineries. These are residential hobby kind of high. I hate to, that kind of diminishes it, but kind of like hobby vines, right?
Precisely. Yeah. This is entirely residential, private owners of private estates, some serious properties and some serious people who have done very well in the world and have not only property in one of the most expensive parts of the world, but also have enough property to consider putting a vineyard on a part of it.
Making my eyes water at the thought of how much some of these, how much one of these people have, and so you had said that there were kind of two businesses there. The vineyard management is what turned you on, but there was also a proper winery. Do you remember kind of the split of those two businesses? Was it like, yeah, do you remember, was the vineyard management something that, the previous owner had and didn't realize how attractive it was, and it was just a little part of the business, you anticipated growing that a ton? Or,
yes,
what was that all
I don't remember
about?
the split of revenue. I would guess it was maybe kind of 60 winery, 40 vines. But the winery wasn't very big either. The guy had done a great job of getting it started, but basically kind of run out of legs and inspiration. And he was pulling his hair out. There's just, there's a lot to do. A winery is a complicated business to run. So he knew that was the good part of his business financially. He had started off and started that business deliberately. And very cleverly kind of made sense of a kind of a very tricky wine market by putting a vineyard management operation alongside it or inside it. So it was an unusual business, right? It's like, what are we talking about, a winery? What do I want to be owning a winery for? It's like even more bananas. And then the kind of the friends that we referred to previously are kind of cautioning in my ear, well, it sounds fun, get me some wine, but what the hell are you doing? So, and then other friends who were absolutely acommercial or uncommercial, they thought, Jacko, that sounds so much fun. Of course, you should totally do that. That sounds completely you. I was getting all sorts of kind of wild and woolly advice, but it was basically me that had to sign the check. And then, step in there on day one and try and figure out what the hell to do next. So I've signed a few big checks in life. We all do, your first house or whatever else. But that was a tricky one to get to the point of comfort. But ultimately I did. And there was quite a few surprises when I walked through the door. I'm sure that's not an uncommon thing for your listeners. There was a lot of, the old principle is caveat emptor, right? Beware, buyer beware.
Sure.
And in due diligence, you're expected to find all of the kind of all of the mines in the field. But ultimately, within due diligence,
what mines caught you that you didn't find in your diligence?
I don't think I want to get into too much detail on that because it'd be unkind to the prior owner. But there were some surprises, some significant surprises within due diligence. You're verifying, but you're still ultimately relying on what someone's telling you, and their version of their business, and they're trying to sell. So day one, the due diligence process continued in a big way, trying to figure out where stuff was and how stuff was being done, and the reality of certain situations. So it was an ongoing voyage of discovery, and not least because even though my dad had worked for wine companies, I had no idea what I was doing. Absolutely no idea. I had never delivered wine through the back door of a supermarket, which I was soon doing. I had never been the harvest intern for the winemaker, which I was soon doing. And it was basically me, a winemaker, and a vineyard guy. That was it. And so I was the delivery driver, the kind of the harvest hand, just basically everything, kind of year one, and so learned the business. So it was really fun.
David, let me a couple of questions here. So you had, just going back to the transaction really quickly, you had pointed out to him, hey, these numbers don't add up. This is really what it's worth. He comes back to you, says, okay, let's talk. I assume you acquire for something closer to what you said the valuation was, and you did not finance it. You did, at least not with an SBA loan. Was there seller financing at all, or was it just?
No, it was essentially a 100% kind of cash purchase. I left him a small percentage of the business, which was my way of trying to ensure his kind of fidelity and cooperation.
Okay. And so the business was literally 3 people? Large?
It felt that way. I think actually remembering it, there was 2 people on the vineyard operation. There was the winemaker, there was myself, and there was an office manager. And then there was, other folks that kind of worked for the company, including the lady who was the wine broker. So yeah, I mean, it was a kind of an upper 6-figure deal. But it was still a pretty raw company. It had kind of proven its market and proven its kind of its operations, proven its ability to make a profit, albeit a small one. But it was still very, very nascent in its market and operations.
And how old was it?
Not entirely sure. That was one of my first questions, but yeah, it seemed like its first 4 years, so probably 8 years old, even though it had a different date above the door.
Okay. And just looking back, I mean, you were self-educating this whole time. We've already talked about how, a lot of the searcher best practices were probably not established or at least certainly not well publicized at the time. And one of those things that you hear constantly today is about, buying above a certain size business. And kind of the sweet spot is 600 to 800,000 SDE, which of course is hard to find, but great if you can get it. This business was, I assume, quite a bit less than that. No management layer. I mean, if you're the one driving the delivery truck, clearly. So, did that, I guess you were signing up for that. You saw what that was going to be like. Do you think in retrospect that you took a much bigger gamble than you realized you were taking at the time, or kind of would you do it over again? I guess just kind of like weigh in on the size of business that you bought.
To me, it didn't feel like that much of a risk because of the recurring revenues, because of the market opportunity for the vineyard management, at least, because of the kind of the fact that the wine at least was well received and clearly the winemaker knew what he was doing, and also because I wasn't taking on any debt. So yeah, I was throwing down a lot of money. But a lot of folks are kind of cautioned against buying a job. Don't buy a company with less than 500K.
Exactly.
You're just buying yourself a job. Like, well, of course you're buying yourself a job. You're buying yourself a job at any scale. This idea of a completely kind of, arm's length or kind of armchair business where you're not heavily involved. That's fine. Way further up the kind of the value chain, 50 mil plus, but below that, even if it's a PE buyer, they're making sure someone is heavily involved. So yeah, I was buying myself a job for a few $100,000 worth of kind of profit, and it was a lot of headaches, but that was just what I wanted, right? I wanted to kind of get in there, get inside the muck and bullets, as we call it, in England, and figure out how to grow this thing and how to make it more successful and more fun.
I love that. It's so gritty and entrepreneurial, and I think just kind of oriented toward in the same way that my personality is. But your vice president buddy at Meta or wherever he was at the time. Probably was just feeling like, the fact that you were going to be not only buying a business, how crazy, but, driving the delivery truck. It just gets crazier and crazier by the moment, David.
Yeah. I mean, just to be clear, there wasn't even a delivery truck, right? I was basically shoving wine in my trunk and running it around the place. So,
right. Even better. Okay.
Yeah.
Carry on.
So yeah, it was fun. I learned a lot. I started to try and learn as much as possible, particularly about vineyard management, and started to assemble a good team. But yeah, at first I couldn't afford a vineyard manager. No way. I mean, it just kind of destroyed my margins. So I started getting more vineyards under management and started learning what I was doing. But basically, I was kind of doing the classic old adage of fake it till you make it. Being out there and telling people that I had a great team. I did. but one under very little actual supervision or direction. And convincing them to let me manage their vineyard or install a new vineyard for them. And so once that started to kind of reach a little bit more sufficient size, hired the first vineyard manager or promoted the first vineyard manager. And then a few years later, kind of hired an excellent one. But basically in all of the different business lines, because within the winery, there's an events business, there's a direct-to-consumer business, there's a wholesale business, there's a vineyard construction business, there's a vineyard management business. There's 5 different kind of business lines. And it's been quite hard to keep it that focused, frankly, because there's always someone in your ear telling you that, you really ought to do this and you really ought to do that. And why don't you spend a lot of money setting up a tasting room or in another city or in a touristic area? Or you can go bust very quickly kind of without focus in any business, but particularly within wine. So yeah, we tried really hard to get excellent people in place and to focus on not just the right kind of business opportunities and projects to kind of evolve how we did things, but also to really make sure that we had very, very, very happy customers and very, very happy employees. And with those 2 things kind of combined with the focus, I don't think you can go too far wrong. I look at the business now, and it's now 5 times the size. It has a really excellent management team, a really good events person, a really good vineyard person, an excellent winemaker, and a really good operations person. And I'm proud of where we've come from and where we've got to, even though there's plenty kind of ahead. But I think one of the things I'm most proud of actually is some of the testimonials on the vineyard management website, where I just see people saying, "Hey, your crews are always really happy, and they come to our vineyard and they're laughing and chatting and joking, and they do a killer job. And you guys really, really, really know what you're doing, and you provide a great service, and thank you." And that's kind of how I hope all of our customers feel. They certainly seem to when we ask them. And so yeah, we're now kind of on a different level than we were then. But this is 10 years later, and there's a few hard battles and a few misses and a few mistakes. Certainly a few mistakes, but we're definitely making headway.
Well, David, everybody would love to own a small business where the customers are thrilled, and even better, the employees are thrilled and happy and fulfilled and always smiling. But easier said than done. What's the secret there?
Well, with the employees, there's so many folks. I mean, it's tricky, right? Because I've basically decided that I don't want to be an employee anymore. And part of the reason for that is I think employees are always valued just up to the amount of money that would stop them from leaving, if they're valued. So you don't pay someone what they're absolutely, definitely, inherently worth to your business so much as kind of like how much they could either be replaced for or kind of like kept in place for. And it's sad, but it's true right across the world. So I can't pay our employees absolutely everything that I would love to pay them, but I do pay them well. And I learned from a very good kind of senior manager or kind of CEO within the software world. It's one guy that I work for kind of on and off, but fairly consistently for 10 years in multiple countries. And he was really, really good at communicating people about what they needed to do in order to earn more for him. And it was always about more responsibility and more kind of recognition and reward for results. And so if you can put more results together and you can take on more responsibility, I will pay you more. And so I try and communicate that to my team, be they vineyard workers or the head of vineyard management, or people in between, or in other functions. It's like I can't pay you the kind of the earth here. We work for a winery. We don't work for a hedge fund. But here's what I pay you. I believe it's good. Do you believe it's good? Great. We're on the same page. Here's how we go forward. And if you take on more responsibilities and you take on more facets of the business and kind of help me focus where I want to be spending my time, then I will pay you more. And so it's treating people with kind of openness and respect and paying them as much as you can. That doesn't sound very controversial or insightful perhaps, but it's just kind of decency towards them. And then also just making it fun, right? I mean, how many bosses have you had that have been zero fun? You know, they can suck the air out of a room at 100 paces. It just beggars belief that they're in charge of people. There's just nobody enjoys working for them, right? And then there's the other category of folks who like it actually make things fun. You know, they've got a good wit or a charm or something about them that makes them somewhat engaging.
Now, is that just your personality, David, or are you doing things like, you know, the weekly pool party? Not literally, but,
I'm
you
not
know, is it planning activities, or is it just bringing a good attitude and being a halfway interesting person?
Yeah, I'm not saying I'm entirely in the second camp. I'm sure I can suck the air out of a room as well, you know, particularly if if it's another vineyard meeting at 6:30 in the morning when they start, but or when we all start. So yeah, I think it's treating people with kind of compassion, kindness, and a bit of humor, and getting them on board with what you're trying to do. Now, I've gone from a world where it used to be PowerPoints to clients and PowerPoints to kind of, you know, to employees and lots of, you know, webinars and seminars and I haven't seen a PowerPoint. I certainly haven't created a PowerPoint for 10 years. And we don't have meetings. We kind of like talk to each other when we see each other. And it's, you know, the winery is actually kind of quite a communal place, and there's a bar, and it kind of, you know, it leads to folks relaxing a little bit. So maybe I'm assisted by that, but I feel like you can make it endlessly formal, and endlessly anal. Or you can make it really kind of just a little bit more compelling, a little bit more human. And if you're organized enough, and that's rather than being some kind of, you know, charming kind of entrepreneur who can kind of, you know, be a Pied Piper and lead people on some merry dance, just organized guy. I incessantly kind of like long to-do lists, and those lists include kind of, you know, what I'm trying to do with people. Where I'm trying to get their business or their kind of function. So yeah, by being somewhat ruthlessly organized and just trying to kind of be decent, I think we have a good and happy team.
David, I have to ask, not to take any credit away from you, but does it help being in the booze business?
Well, one thing that really helps being in the booze business is that no one is pissed off. All right, so you know, anybody who walks through your door is immediately their best selves. Within software, if you know some piece of software doesn't work or it's too expensive or something, you know, there's a lot of kind of crabby behavior, and that kind of, there isn't much of that. But yeah, having plenty of wine helps in other ways. It's a good way to kind of, you know, to thank and charm people for sure. But yeah, the most wine I drink these days, other than kind of just for my own enjoyment, is at 6:30 in the morning. So that's when the vineyard crews start. Okay, that's when they prefer to get the kind of the jump on the day, and that's where they kind of, when we all meet up. And that's when the winemakers tend to shove wine in my face for tasting, because it's before coffee, and it's before breakfast, and it's with the palate clean, so to speak. And so yeah, I'm not getting soaked at 6:30 in the morning, but you know, I quite regularly have a glass of wine.
But maybe a little buzzed.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, here I'm smiling ear to ear just listening to it. So I can imagine that your employees are smiling a lot.
Yeah, we have a good time.
Yeah.
We have a good time and they're good people. And if there's some bad apple, we get when we ask them to leave. We've had plenty of bad apples that just didn't fit, didn't gel, and piss people off. Like, okay, see ya.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, David, I want to turn to a slightly less levity here and back to the numbers in those early days, because I just it's important for people to have specifics to think about these deals and these acquisitions. Do you remember what your own take home, your own SDE was that first year in the business? I mean, were you taking a significant pay cut from your software job? I assume you were, because you were earning very well in software land. But were you at least making six figures in day one in the business?
First year, I was really just investing in kind of patching up problems and putting more working capital into it than I thought I'd originally planned to. And it was 6 months more than a year, because I ended up buying it midsummer. So yeah, the rest of that 6 months was not a profitable time, and it was quite a scary time. As I again learned some things and kind of figured out the wrinkles and some of the heightened levels of seasonality within the business, so on and so forth. But then the first full year. Things weren't very well, and I don't want to get into SD specifics, but I didn't earn as much as I had in software, but I also had plenty of money to kind of pay myself and go out to eat. So yeah, it was fine from kind of 6 months onwards.
And for how long was it that you were wearing all the hats? Not necessarily, speaking beyond kind of the crisis time, but like I assume you were still kind of like, doing everything for even beyond when you kind of like acclimated to the kind of crisis and seasonality. How long did that last?
Well, the first significant hire was 6 to 9 months after purchase. So the previous owner had managed something like 20 events throughout the year at the winery. And it seemed obvious that there was a possibility to do more events. We're not in a kind of a touristic area. We're not in a kind of a street fall area. So we wanted to focus our winery's opening and kind of public face on venue rental, rather than people just wandering in for a wine tasting and maybe buying a bottle of wine. We were much more interested in having the place full of 150, 200 people, all having a great time and drinking plenty of wine. So anyway, we wanted to do more events. And there'd only been 20 the previous year. So I started looking into it and started to realize also that the predominant folk booking events are women. I just felt that maybe the kind of the person to really kind of kick this on wasn't a middle-aged English dude again. So yeah, I found an events director, and she agreed that there was a potential here, but it was very raw, and there was very few systems and certainly no SOPs, and she had to kind of figure out a lot. But she did a cracking job, and within 2 or 3 years, we were up to having 100 plus events, and it's since grown from there. So yeah, that was kind of the first person I chose to hire, and kind of first person I chose to invest in to replace myself, and then each year, without it being kind of so rigidly scheduled like that, I was finding the money to invest in another person and another kind of another evolution of how we did things, and to get things off my plate. I think one good principle for CEOs or business kind of departmental managers or business owners, whoever, one good principle in general is try and almost make yourself redundant. Try and stop doing the kind of the day-to-day stuff, find some other way for that day-to-day stuff to get done. The adage of work on the business, not in the business, is really true for us all. And so yeah, I've managed to kind of, through focusing on that principle, steadily kind of evolve the business and evolve the team, and so grow the company.
And you're now quite free and to the point where you're searching again, which we're going to close with here in a second. But still, a couple more questions. You had touched on how much growth there'd been. So when you bought the business, it was you and 3 or 4 other people. Now it's you said a team of what, 15 or 20? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I think that the best answer is we're basically 5 times larger in almost every respect in terms of scale of operations and revenue of operations and profit of operations and so on and so forth, where we basically got to the point now where we are kind of away from the early days and to the point where the business is somewhat successful. That's always a relative term, but it's doing okay. And I can now decide, do I want to keep investing my time and capital in the business, or do I want to maybe put some eggs in some other baskets? There are definitely things I could invest into to secure the next stages of growth for the winery, but also for the vineyard management operation. The thing that's good about the business now is that 60% of its revenue is recurring and 20% of it is repeat. So recurring from the vineyard management, repeat from people who continue to buy our wines and stock their shelves with it. And then 20% is kind of the event stuff, which is not repeat, but also, reasonably reliable because there's enough businesses locally that want somewhere interesting to hold their events and enough people who want somewhere to party. So it's pretty steady. And I could therefore kind of keep pushing myself and and those lines of business, those different kind of revenue streams up and up and up. Or I could say, okay, well, what else is there to the left and right? I can spend 5 days, or I could spend 50 days. If there were 50 days in a week, I'm sure I could spend 50 days at the winery. But I also feel like I could compress it down to 2 and maybe even 1 with a different hire. And so, yeah, I've been looking around for what might be next.
Mm-hmm. And just going back to revenues, I don't know how public you can be about it, but is it fair to say that the business was, $1 million in revenue, give or take, back then? And so now you're looking at more like a $5 million business?
Yeah, again, I'm not into sharing specifics, but excuse me. But yeah, we are definitely kind of 5 times the size on revenues, and on profits, and hopefully on the kind of the enterprise value as well. Although that depends on multiples, and some people say that winery multiples are inflated, not just inflated, but high. Like you see some businesses, changing hands for 5+. But also there's not that many winery transactions that don't involve real estate. And therefore those transactions are kind of difficult to kind of measure up against. I don't own any real estate. I don't own any vineyards. I don't own the winery. I'm a tenant. So yeah, we're doing fine, and it's been great to see that growth. But I feel like there's another trick or two in me yet. So we'll see.
Well, let's close with that. Elaborate a little bit more. So you're at least on your LinkedIn, you're a self-described searcher now. So I assume you're somewhat actively looking around. And this time around, will you buy yourself a job? Well, you made a good point that, like, of course, whatever, anytime somebody buys a business, they're likely buying themselves 40 hours of work a week, if not more. So yes, you're buying yourself something that's going to fill your time. But I guess what I'm really asking is size of business. Will now that you've got a little bit of capital, a little bit of experience, do you think you'll go for something significantly bigger this time around, or does it depend, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, so my search has definitely kind of evolved or set up on the basis of ideally looking for 500 plus SDE. I don't really want to be stretching myself and putting kind of personal guarantees together for loans that are kind of for businesses that are maybe worth more than the 2-3 million level, just that there's a limit to kind of my comfort and kind of ability to cross support kind of those levels of debt. So yeah, I'm looking for kind of a bolt-on. I think that bolt-on would be ideally of that size, but also it just depends on the business again, right? So if I can find a really sensible business that's smaller than that I feel like I can grow to within that and enjoy doing it, then I'd be more than happy to. There's definitely a risk-reward trade-off, right? There's a lot of folks that say, well, it has to be a certain size in order to be, to significantly change things. Like, yeah, well, it depends, A, whose money you're using, and B, what you're trying to achieve. So I think I'm realistic about the fact that, be it a small, medium, or large business within that kind of sub 5 million category, it's always going to be a lot of work. But if I was putting the top end of that on the table, I would probably be wanting to spend 80 hours a week making damn sure it worked out. And at the lower end of the table, I can kind of I can take a bit less kind of intensity to a kind of a lower value company.
And when you say bolt-on, does that mean it's going to become part of Post and Trellis, or could it be something completely unrelated?
Yeah, no. I mean, I'm looking. One of the main things I'm looking for is a maintenance company, and there's lots of different forms of maintenance. But I feel like within the vineyard management business, I've really figured out how to, not the perfect way to, but ways to run a field service operations. So crews of people out there servicing and maintaining something.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, it would be a kind of a bolt-on, but they would be separate entities and separate teams and separate everything. But that's one part of my search, and we'll see what I find. It might end up being a circus or a chocolate company. We don't know. Although I'm not sure my wife would agree with the circus one so much anymore.
I love it. Well, David, what an adventure this last 10 or 13 years have been for you. And
exactly.
It was just really, really inspiring. Really, you put the fun back in business, and really cool to hear that your employees seem to agree. And it just, I think a lot of people out there will be envious of just the popping bottles that is your life. I know that's probably a little too rosy, but it sure seems fun. So anyway, thanks a lot, sir, for coming on and sharing. And let me know when you make that second acquisition, and we'll have you back.
Sounds good. Well, it's been really fun talking to you as always. I wish you well, and hope you're settling in on the East Coast there.
Thanks a lot, David. Till next time.
Cheers.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with David Page. Make sure you subscribe to the channel here. Once, sometimes twice per week, I'm releasing new interviews with people who have bought businesses. So lots more great stories to come. Stories that can help you on your path to acquire a business.